emergency kit. It contains life-saving medications like ivermectin, Z-Pak, and antibiotics. Stock them before they block them.
This is a special report.
Knowing how to invest your money is harder than ever before. Dealing with stock market volatility, record debt, and terrorist attacks requires new thinking. At U.S. Asset Management, we can help you see the world more clearly so that you can move beyond the chaos and invest with confidence. Call us, visit us online, or drop by our office. U.S. Asset Management, helping you make better decisions with your money.
Тому що я щойно побачила, як летить ракета. І я почула це.
So welcome back to Armed Forces Press. We are honored to be with Pete Blaber. Pete's been on the show many times on our podcast across the network. He's a former Delta Force commander, and he's very knowledgeable on Ukraine, just like he dug into Afghanistan. We had him at an event down in Tampa at SOCOM years ago. But Pete, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me here, Todd. And so it's a crazy situation. As you know, we're going to talk about Ukraine here. And what I want to do before I talk about the article, talk about some of the insights in that article that a lot of people don't know, and then the feedback from it and where to go forward. I want to start off any discussion about Ukraine should start with the death and destruction that this war has caused and created. And that's what we're talking about. That's how I got involved. I got involved with this. I've been to Kyiv. I have some very close friends who happen to be working in the two government agencies, most prominent government agencies on the ground back in 13 and 14. And then repeat trips all the way up through the war, through now. And our conversation started talking as veterans about what's happening to these soldiers on both sides. It is horrific. And the civilians, especially in the eastern Ukraine, Donbass region, who were slaughtered from 2014 to 2022, 14,000, mostly civilians, mostly elderly who couldn't afford to move, were killed, blown to pieces by indiscriminate artillery and rocket fire. So to anyone who talks about Ukraine, anyone who has a sign in their front yard, I stand with Ukraine. If you're not talking about the death and destruction and the bottom line that it has to stop, because no one really knows why they're fighting. There's a lot of victims here of propaganda, and the victims include those patriotic Ukrainians who think they're fighting for one reason, but as you'll hear and as you can read in my article, that's not why they're fighting.
Yeah,
so
we essentially lied to them to get them to fight, I think. But go ahead, Pete. Give us an overview and let's go from there.
It's a law of unintended consequences. So the article, which CD Media printed, it's also on peteblaber.substack.com. I constantly update it. Is called How to Make Sense of the Ukraine War, a chronology of key events and decisions. And like I said, I didn't write the article to take sides. I don't have sides. I have huge respect for Ukraine and Ukrainians and huge respect for Russia and Russians. I
Mhm.
wrote it as a veteran who actually gives a shit about the guys getting blown to pieces and the civilians who have lost everything. And putting myself in their shoes, the fact that they're there because of the senseless decisions made by non-elected and some elected officials, all global elites who could care less about the death and destruction. To them, it's collateral damage. You can hear that whenever they talk about it, especially how there's actually talk about continuing the war in Europe right now. And the paper is written as a timeline of facts that reveal the actual events of the past so we can make good, sensible decisions about what should happen in the future, which is where we're at right now.
Yeah.
You mentioned I wrote a chronology about the fall of Afghanistan. And the reason I did that is not just because I'm into timelines or chronology. It's because history matters. We live life forward, but we understand it backwards. And that's not like some little ism, that's a biologic fact. Because although the past and present may seem like separate worlds, they're indelibly linked inside our brain. The same section of our neocortex that stores memories of the past is also responsible for forethought and making decisions about the future. And we know that because brain injured patients who can't remember the past are incapable of making decisions about the future. You can hand them a menu and they can't figure out what to do with it. They can look outside their houses with dark skies, heavy winds, and temperature drop, and they can say, I think I'll go to the beach today. And those are just examples of how our brains work. They have to pivot off knowledge. So why is that important? Why is that biologic fact important? Because clinical psychologists understand this. If you want to manipulate people, the first principle, the first foundational action you take is to erase history. And that's what these extremist politicians, the mainstream media, big tech had been colluding with them to do for the last 10 to 15 years. Erase the past, erase knowledge of what happened so you can create this new knowledge, this manufactured history. And without knowledge of the past, we can't make good decisions about the future. And of course, as you'll hear when I go on with the feedback, and this common theme of what happened is the law of unintended consequences. And I bring it up because
I think they are intended consequences, but go ahead.
you're probably right. I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt.
I understand.
But on a bigger scale, if you just take what we've been through in the last 5 years, Russian collusion, the pandemic, and now the Ukraine war, these are, all massive psychological manipulation events. And in all of them, they've tried to erase the past, erase knowledge of the past, or hide it, repurpose it, change it, so that you make different decisions about the future. And so that's why it's important to go back to understand some of these key events that have happened, so that we can again make those better decisions in the future. So one of the reasons why it's so important to come out and write something like this is because if you've noticed from the beginning, if all the way back to 2014, there's been no mainstream media coverage of this war.
No, you don't see any video of the front at all.
Exactly.
Zero. Yeah.
So that from the very beginning befuddled me, especially as a veteran, because I grew up when Vietnam was happening. I was a little kid, and obviously Vietnam set the standard for the press. If you're a media organization, wars are where you get the best ratings, the highest ad revenues, and for individual reporters, That's
Yeah.
where they make their name and
Their
win
act, yeah.
Pulitzer prizes.
Yeah.
So, and then to see them everywhere in Iraq, Afghanistan, and always fighting to get onto the front lines, and then to see this war and no media, you had to wonder, well, thanks to Doge, we now don't have to speculate anymore. USAID controls 90% of the world's mainstream media. That's a fact. They were paying off the BBC. They were paying off Reuters, AP. They were paying off Political, everybody. And in Ukraine especially, 100% of the mainstream media in Ukraine is bankrolled by USAID. And that there were a couple independent news organizations that survived, but in 2019, Zelensky outlawed all independent media. All media in Ukraine comes from one source. It's all propaganda. And this goes back to that law of unintended consequences and the big lesson, which is the individuals most affected by mass psychosis and psychological manipulation aren't the people that the psychological manipulation is intended for. It's intended to change people's mind. So if you take the vaccine, the pandemic, the psychological manipulation was intended to change people who were hesitant to get a vax. They didn't want to put foreign substance into their body. And hadn't seen safety or efficacy data that would make them change their mind. What happens though, and what clinical psychologists now admit is a lesson learned from all this, is it turns out psychological manipulation has its biggest effect on people who have already thrown in the towel and agreed with the perpetrators. So
that's why you have so much like cognitive dissonance going on right now, because people can't change their worldview, right?
Well said. Well said. And that's why, you get these people spitting saliva with purple veins popping out of their head, telling you, the unvaxxed, or you, the person who doesn't support Ukraine, that you're a propagandist, or, or something else. So psychological manipulation affects people who have already agreed with it. So when you apply that now to Ukraine, you realize what was happening right from the beginning. Even the good people of Western Ukraine, not the ultranationalist neo-Nazis, the regular hardworking Ukrainians, the only source of reality they had was coming from the US bought and paid for, US EU bought and paid for mainstream media inside Ukraine and out. So another victim of the propaganda and the false narrative around Ukraine were the people of Ukraine. And again, back to how I got involved with this with other government workers, our passion was these guys have been manipulated too. These great patriots, and Ukraine, the estimates are 600,000 plus dead, about 400,000 maimed and wounded. Those are their best and brightest. These are good.
They've wiped out a generation, and the country's been depopulated. Half the country's left. Several million impacted physically by the war. So we've done nothing for Ukraine. Let's put it that way.
Yep. And so again, the lesson away from mass psychosis is it affects the unintended consequences. It affects the people that support what the perpetrators are saying, and it doesn't have much of an effect on those who are against it because it's full of holes. And all you got to do is pressure test what they're saying, look at the facts, go back into history to get the reality of the situation on the ground. And you can then realize this is just propaganda. I'm not listening to it. And I think that's what's happening across the globe right now with these populist movements popping up everywhere. It's the people's movements is what they should be called. So back to the article. The article is a timeline. It starts in 91, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. I'm not going to go into high detail, but we know what happened at the negotiating table. our national security advisor, James Baker, gave an ironclad guarantee that the U.S. and NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And Gorbachev bought into that, agreed with it. And by the way, National Archives now show it wasn't just James Baker in the Bush senior administration. It was Margaret Thatcher from Britain. It was Helmut Kohl from Germany. And it was Francois Mitterrand from France. All gave the same guarantee at different times to Russia, not 1 inch eastward. So, what started happening in '94 under Bill Clinton was a decision was made where we need to start trying to bring some of these former Soviet republics into the NATO fold. And it was announced in 1994 at the Munich Security Conference. And then he followed that up in Prague a couple of days later by saying, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So in those 90s, I believe it was, a groupthink thing. They just started, hey, wouldn't it be great to bring these countries into NATO? And it really was like a game. And they were still playing the old game of the Soviet Union. So that's my positive interpretation. The negative is the military-industrial complex and all of its, representatives who were politicians in both Democratic and Republican administrations. They realized something else. They realized that without an enemy, they couldn't keep this NATO gravy train going. And one thing everyone needs to understand is when a new country's brought into NATO, they need to reorganize and redesign their entire military infrastructure. They need NATO-compatible weapons. In some of these Eastern European countries, not only they need NATO-compatible weapons, they needed infrastructure. Their train tracks that carry NATO supplies weren't the right size, so they needed all new train tracks.
It's like that scene in War Dogs when they have the picture of the guy and he's naming off the prices of every piece of his equipment, right? 14,000, 10,000, 2,000,
Yeah. And it adds up. And so you don't hear this often, but another seminal event of '94 was the first lobbying group for expansion of NATO started in Washington, D.C. And it was started by, surprise, surprise, former CEOs and presidents of military contractors, some of the largest military contractors, as well as retired State Department and CIA personnel. Also in the 90s, and again, one of the things that cannot be debated is history, and you can still go back online and look at the articles, and you can look at New York Times articles because they spell it out proudly and openly back in the 90s, but you can also look at videos as they started to accumulate in the 2000s. So in the 90s, any article you read about expansion in NATO mentions the chief supporter of expanding NATO in the U.S. government, who was a senator from Delaware named Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things I learned as I was doing my research. He's in everything. He's speeches. He's part of every committee. Joe Biden, starting in the 90s, was we've got to expand NATO, and there's no discussion. There's no other alternative to it. And remember, there were no lobbying groups for not expanding NATO. So as a politician, if you wanted to win and you were in a close race and you were being outspent, you had an option: either take money from these guys who had plenty of money to give, who support NATO expansion, or continue to go on without any money. And that's kind of how the military-industrial complex affects foreign policy. And that's what was happening in the 90s. So fast forward that into right up to 2000, Vladimir Putin becomes president of Russia in the year 2000. if you listen to the mainstream media and Europeans and left-wing politicians in the U.S., all you'll hear is barbarian, murderer, dictator,
Yeah.
and over time, what you notice is a pattern. The only other person who gets that kind of treatment is Donald Trump. So what struck me, and I'll talk about this when I tell you about some of the feedback I've gotten from former military who are in Ukraine right now, is that there's Trump derangement syndrome and there's Putin derangement syndrome, and they're both the byproducts of propaganda designed to character assassinate and
Well, it's not
besmirch
just the
those individuals.
leaders. It's not just the leaders. I had a meeting, and I've interviewed him several times. Bob Amsterdam, who's the attorney counsel for a Jewish guy for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because they're being destroyed. And his term he uses dehumanization of the Russians. I mean, they're literally anyone Russian, not just the leadership, but anything Russian. They have to destroy it and make it be unhuman. I
I
found that.
saw I saw that article, that interview you did. It was great, and I couldn't agree more. That's well said. And look, as we go on in this discussion, that's an important distinction to make. When I talk about the European position here, I'm talking about Mark Rutte and Ursula von der Leyen, not elected officials. I'm talking about Macron. I'm talking about the whoever that new leader of Germany is. Keir Starmer in Great Britain. I'm not talking about the British people, the German people. Just like when we talk about what happened in Ukraine in 2013-14, this was not the American people or America. This was unelected deep state administrators having their way, globalists having their way, not working for their people, not even telling their people what they're doing. They're working on their own agenda, and that's what's still going on. And again, anyone who says that about Russians doesn't know any Russians, has never been to Russia, and anyone who honestly looks at world leaders over just the last 5 years and listens to them talk, you can't walk away thinking anything other than one of the only ones who speaks factually and knows what he's talking about is Vladimir Putin.
Well, if you listen to the Danish official, I forget her title. I don't know if it was the prime minister or whatever.
She's the head of the EU.
She said the peace is the biggest threat in Ukraine right now, bigger than the threat of war. I found that fascinating. It's like 1984, war is peace, freedom is slavery, or whatever that is.
It's incredible. Yeah, and of course she ever stepped foot on a battlefield as any of her children could possibly getting drafted or volunteering to go fight there? No. This is what I mean about the individuals who support the continued fighting in Ukraine are individuals who don't care about Ukrainians, obviously don't care about Russians, and they don't care about the people. They don't care about their future, their economy. This is a game to them. This is a personal thing. They've already told the world what their opinion is, and by God, I'm not going to be shown to be wrong. And it's, like you said, it's disgusting. But we're on the right course right now. So hopefully they continue to be ignored as Trump and Putin move forward. But again, let's go forward again. 2000, Putin is elected. He's the most pro-Western leader ever to come out of either the Soviet Union or Russia, and he wants to move closer to the West. He realizes, and not for some, hey, you're the greatest. It's because he wants what's best for his country. He wants Russia to be economically solvent. He understands the geography. They're part of the European continent, and you need to have free trade with your neighbors. It makes sense. You save money for your people. You open markets for your people. And so Putin very logically, instead of just words, showed actions. 2 days before 9/11 happened, he called Bush and told him about the assassination of Shah Massoud in the Panjshir Valley, told him that this was a hit job from Al Qaeda, and told him all of our indicators say something really bad's going to happen. Well, 2 days later, 9/11 happened. And right away, again, one of the first calls Bush had with a foreign leader was with Putin. And Putin would say, "Hey, we're here to help. The enemy of my enemy is my friend." So, these guys knew they had a common enemy, and so Putin wanted to work together with Bush. And instead of just words, he showed actions. He provided equipment. We needed Mi-17s to fly low vis, to not violate the Afghans' tendency to react to foreign equipment, foreign militaries, and it was hugely important. We also needed them for their ability to fly at high altitude, which many of our helicopters weren't ready to do at the time. He also provided operational intelligence, and I was the receiver. I used all of the things that he provided: operational intelligence on caves, redoubts, places that the Mujahideen had used against them. And finally, he provided us something incredibly operational: maps. There were no maps of Afghanistan. The map I used in the Battle of Shahi Kot, also known as Anaconda, was a Russian 1/50,000 map. And I could not have navigated, understood where the enemy might be, understood how to follow them without those maps. So Putin, instead of just words, showed actions. And I will also add that on the ground in Afghanistan at the time, every military, all of my colleagues, we were emboldened. We had more confidence because we were understood. This is new times. This war may seem like it's against a nefarious, undefinable enemy, but we're with Russia. Russia is our ally now. And so together we have a real opportunity to neutralize this threat.
Obviously, that had to be destroyed.
Exactly. Exactly.
The globalists could not let that happen.
And that's what happened. I think in the Bush administration, and now we learn more and more about Bush and the way he presided over his administration. He was not the thought leader. He was not the one listening and asking the tough questions. It was Rumsfeld and Cheney who were running things at the time. And he also, Condoleezza Rice, amazing person, but she's another, I don't know what you call them, Russia phobe. She thinks, everything negative about Russia. All these individuals who studied the Soviet Union and were taught, that the Soviet Union's our enemy, needed to carry that over after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And they carried it over on Russia. And again, history shows how ridiculous that proposition is. Why we claim to hate Russia, Russia's bad about everything, like you said, dehumanized. We have bent over backwards to try to curry favor with Ukraine and Georgia. Yet a brief review of history tells you that Stalin is from Georgia, Leonid Brezhnev is from Ukraine, and the two most prominent former modern leaders of Russia are Gorbachev and Putin, the most pro-Western of all of them. And we're trying to say
there's some deep rabbit holes in Ukraine you can go down as to the history there, especially in Western Ukraine, with some of the, Banderites and all that. But, I have a theory that Putin, around the Russian timeframe when he started rearming, I think that he saw what the West was becoming, and he started rearming Russia at that point. What say you?
I think, I think he was doing what we would do here, what we're doing right now. You understand the world, and you have to have a strong military to defend your country against. And anyone who cares about their country cares about their military. And I think he realized with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was a huge gut punch to a lot of the republics, especially Russia. And of course, his job as the president was to build that back up, to build the economy and the military back up. And I don't think he had, a specific reason. Obviously, he was hoping to have a better relationship with the West. He told Clinton and Bush he wanted to be, he floated the idea of Russia joining NATO. And you don't do that if you're, if you've got something in the back of your head, I want to, defeat these guys, destroy them or whatever. I think he was just building it back up as part of national pride and what elected leaders should do in the world in 2000 and the world today.
I think he did that, and also just as a cautionary, because he didn't understand what the West was. At that point, we were, raping a lot of the Russian industry after the 90s and all of that. And he was just looking at this going, wow, I need to rebuild. Anyway, go ahead. I interrupted you.
Well, no. So, but your point, it's a great interruption because, Cheney, Rumsfeld said, hey, screw it. We already look how powerful we are. We just defeated the Taliban, and I was on the ground then. So the euphoria of 2002 was only euphoria to those who were short-sighted about the enemy and what had actually just happened on the ground. But I believe Cheney and Rumsfeld were like, we don't need Russia to help us with Afghanistan. We just destroyed the enemy ourselves. This global war on terror is not that complex. And we need to protect against other threats. And remember, our imaginations were now taking off that, terrorists were going to be launching missiles at us. And I think that was part of the Bush administration saying, hey, we got to go back to Reagan's quote unquote Star Wars, the Iron Dome, as it's called today around the world. We've got to build a new way to defend America from rogue threats, rogue missile threats. And we don't need Russia anymore. That our anti-ballistic missile treaty doesn't make sense. They're not going to launch at us. And Bush just, without thinking anything of it, announced he was going to unilaterally pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was insane. And I think that's where Russia was like, what, WTF? Okay, this has been the great leveling, the great, we trust each other. Let's keep going down this road.
If you haven't noticed, gold has reached a new high, all-time highs actually, and keeps going up every day. Why is that? It's because precious metals are a long-time historical store of value. And if you own a portfolio and you have assets in the fiat currencies, i.e. stocks, bonds, cash, or whatever, you're vulnerable to hyperinflation, which is coming as our debt explodes another trillion every 90 days. It's really scary. So how do you protect yourself? Go to Advisor Metals. If you look on any of our cdm.press sites, about halfway down, there's an ad for Advisor Metals. Click on it, fill out the form for your contact info, and Ira Bishotsky will contact you and talk to you. It's an easy conversation. There's no sales pitch. He's completely verified by us. He has a regulatory background we've checked into. We've checked with his bankers. We've checked with his IRA custodians for metals, and we can highly recommend Advisor Metals and IRA. So go to Advisor Metals. If you call them directly, tell them we sent you at CDM, and he'll definitely take care of you. But protect your portfolio because you really need to. It's coming. Thank you.
And he unilaterally stiff-armed it, said we're not in it anymore. And that was, I think, a bigger mistake than anyone understood at the time. It sent Russia right into that mode, and it was their first big indicator that, hey, I can't even trust this guy I hung out at his ranch with, and he came over here and hung out with me. They say one thing and do something
Yeah,
else.
Jeffrey Sachs was talking about that on Tucker, that ABM issue.
Yeah, it's huge.
Mhm.
So, that takes us into the early 2000s. 2004 was the first Ukrainian color revolution, and that wasn't a popularized term back then. What would become the definition of color revolution was happening naturally back then. The way to play this game of stealing old USSR satellites was to use the new omnipotent power of the mainstream media, which governments realized if you control, and most did even in 2004, then you can manipulate the people in a country. But what was really happening was the internet and social media were rising up, and even in 2004, you could see the potential to use the internet to sway people's opinion, to pull the wool over their eyes about what happened. And that's what happened in 2004. Viktor Yanukovych won that election. The U.S. and NATO decided, hey, this guy is pro-Russia. We need to do something about it. They used the internet, social media tools, and they pumped. I was only aware of 65 million. That it may come out to be more money than that, but we pumped 65 million. I was working in the Pentagon at the time. $65 million into Ukraine. That buys a lot of people, buys a lot of votes, a lot of organizations. That was one of the first uses of non-government organizations to do the groundwork, to make things happen on the ground. And they overturned the election, and Yanukovych was pulled out. The pro-EU, pro-Western candidate was put in. He was a disaster, and the Ukrainians understood that their country was not doing better. So in 2010, actually, it happened in 2009, the election, but in 2010, just like us, Yanukovych re-ran, won the election, certified by the EU, and in 2010 was inaugurated as the president of Ukraine. He ran on a completely neutral package, completely neutral, philosophy. He was not going to be pro-Russian. He was going to be equal to both sides. He's from the Donbass region. So, he's an ethnic Russian, but in that election, he won a majority of votes across the country. Some say as high as 58% of the electorate voted for him. So if people who understand the ethnic makeup of Ukraine, before the war, it was about 60% Ukrainian and 40% ethnic Russian. And you can debate a few points either way, but that's what pollsters and everyone else agrees was the makeup. And so Yanukovych won on both sides. He won in Western Ukraine. He won in Eastern Ukraine on a neutral platform. He was not going to favor one or the other, but the EU and the US, that wasn't good enough. And so in that exact time frame, the decision was made in some closed door room. Hey, we need to get rid of this guy. We need to put an EU Western friendly president in charge of Ukraine. And so I mentioned before, color revolutions were not, there was probably no definition back then, but by 2010, it had been tried and tested in other former Soviet satellite countries. They had refined a bunch of techniques. Social media now, Facebook was everywhere. The spring revolution had already happened. We'd already used social media to manipulate masses. And so, believe it or not, it had become a formalized process in the US State Department and in the EU, in Great Britain, in the MI6 and the CIA also. There was actually a department in the US State Department with a name similar to the Department of Color Revolutions. And so they sent the head of that department, Victoria Nuland, over to Ukraine to lead this effort to overthrow the Yanukovych government. And there was actually playbooks at this point for how to do a color revolution. And the first thing you do is you create dissent, usually around an election. But the next election, I think Yanukovych's next election was 16. I think they're every 6 years. Yeah, 4 to 9. So 16. So they couldn't overturn the election. It had already been certified by the EU. So at the time, the topic du jour in Ukraine, Ukraine's economy was not doing well. That's been a constant, but in 2010, it was not doing well. And so the EU, they needed money, and the EU made them an offer, and it was a $17 billion loan with incredible restrictive strings attached to it. The worst of which was not just government monitoring and EU fingers in most of the Ukrainian ministries, but it would come with a 44% price increase in natural gas. And natural gas is the main fuel used in Ukraine to heat homes. At this same time, Yanukovych, so that's an option. So it's EU loan, 15 billion, huge strings attached, 40 to 44% increase in natural gas. His other option was offered by Russia, which was a $15 billion loan, no strings attached, same terms, monetary terms, and a 33% discount on gas. So that was the choice. And when you understand that, then you can go back, you can look online, you can look on videos, articles, mainstream media. They try to make it out that the Yanukovych, when he decided to go with the Russian option, this was totally against what his people wanted, didn't make any sense. And of course, the reality is all the opposite is true. This loan made sense for the Ukrainian economy. It made sense for the Ukrainian people, and it made sense for Viktor Yanukovych, who cared about getting reelected in 2016. But that's not the spin that the EU and the US put on it, and they saw this as a way to create the dissent that I was talking about, to create the chasm that would lead to some sort of revolution and overthrow of the government. And Victoria Nuland pulled out the playbook for it, and that's exactly what they did. They began changing the narrative with worldwide mainstream media. How could he possibly do this? And, you know, as Donald Trump has pointed out a few times in the last few weeks, the US, however many billions we gave them, 200, 300 billion, we had no strings attached. These weren't loans. We just decided to give them that money. Every penny Europe has given to Ukraine is a loan with terms and strings attached. So when you think about this moment that we decide to overthrow the Ukrainian government, we're doing it because they didn't take a $17 billion loan for the EU, not even, you know, for the US. And it wasn't about NATO, it was about the EU. The NATO stuff started creeping in to the narrative afterwards. Like I said, Victoria Nuland and the Color Revolution administrators saw this as, you know, page one of the playbook. and they began pumping money through the NGOs in Ukraine, and Soros's NGO had been there since '93. So they were well established, and the U.S. aid money, as we've now confirmed, was being paid directly to Soros's NGOs as well as two other prominent NGOs, and they were the ones who worked through social media, who hired coordinators and administrators to actually run the protests, to not only send out messages all across social media announcing, hey, be at this intersection at this time, we're going to be protesting. And really what started as protesting just corruption. That was the messaging, was corruption. It then led to, look, to show you how corrupt they are, they just turned down this great offer from the EU and our ability to join the EU, which would have made our economy better and all your lives better. So you started with this propaganda through social media, hiring of opponents and opposition groups. And of course, the mistake of all mistakes that they made was one of those opposition groups was the far right, the ultranationalist neo-Nazis of Ukraine, who they hired purposefully to be the tip of the spear, to be the hammer. They knew that a bunch of young people in Maidan Square protesting are not going to overturn the government. We need to overrun the government. We need to create a threat that makes them flee. And the neo-Nazis and ultranationalists were the perfect venue for that. I should add something else that I learned, and I know you're very knowledgeable of the history of these neo-Nazi organizations in Western Ukraine. The CIA had a long-running relationship, financial, operational relationship with these neo-Nazis, because when the Iron Curtain went up right after World War II ended in the mid-40s, they were our first and most formidable behind-the-lines, stay-behind asset to provide some kind of knowledge of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. And they were very good at it. And they were naturals to hire to do that because no one doubted their hatred of ethnic Russians as well as Jewish people and many other minorities across the world. So there was a long-running relationship already on the CIA MI6 side with the neo-Nazi ultranationalists, but they were paid and they were hired by the NGOs to be the tip of the spear, to be the real threat in the Maidan protests. They started in November, went through the cold months of December, January. You had the sniping incident, again, a massive propaganda incident that has still to this day, if you look up Maidan, you'll see mainstream media, nothing but propaganda. Yet the guy, if you listen to the people on the ground and those that investigated it, there's pretty much no doubt that it's almost farcical to say that government security did this, because out of 110 killed, 60 of them were police. And actually witnesses saw a neo-Nazi sniper up in, I think the building that overlooks the Maidan Square. I can't remember if it's the Commerce Building or a different building, but they were up in that building, and every victim was shot with the same caliber of weapon. So it didn't hold any water, but this was a catalytic event. It infuriated, it was spun as the government just shot all these innocent civilians, no mention of the police who died. These are martyrs. Their pictures are all up. And again,
still to this day, the pictures are up.
They are. And again, this is not, to any Ukrainians listening, we don't find you at fault. this was what you were fed. This was the overwhelming media narrative, and it was made believable by the falsehoods that they presented around it. But anyway, this took the protests up to the next level. Independent analysis of the violence that occurred through December and January shows, and the analysis is social media and mainstream media shows that even though these far-right neo-nationalists, neo-Nazis were, a smaller percentage of the protesters, they were leading all the violence. You'll see the neo-Nazis, neo-nationalists at the front. You won't see young women, young men randomly, clashing with police. You see the neo-Nazi stormtroopers, and they were paid to do that. All the independent analysis shows that. It's in my paper, a couple of the studies that show they were everywhere, and they were everywhere that there was violence. And of course, everyone in Ukraine is watching this. So what I said earlier about the two-edged sword of propaganda and attempting mass psychological manipulation, the law of unintended consequences always occurs. So remember, all of Eastern Ukraine was watching this too. And if you watch the protests and the violence in the protests, you saw neo-Nazis, and you heard in their interviews with them, these guys frothing at their mouth, saying things like, Ukraine is for Ukrainians. The only good Russian is a dead Russian. These are all on videos too. So for people who want to go back and watch, 100 hours of videos, you can see all this. And that's the important thing about seeing it, is not to prove it. It's to show you what these Eastern Ukrainians, these ethnic Russians, were watching as this is unfolding.
There was definitely ethnic cleansing going on. We had reporters in Donbass telling us that, for a year. So.
Yep. So, but remember, this is the lead up. So Yanukovych hasn't been overthrown yet. So now we get into 2014, and on February 4th of 2014, on YouTube actually is an intercepted phone call. The Russians intercepted a phone call between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine, talking about who the new prime minister should be, the new president, who they believe the best candidate was, and why. That's the famous call where she also says, fuck the EU. She doesn't want to wait for them. They wanted to negotiate. She didn't want to do that at that time. So this intercepted phone call, you can still listen to it, showed three foundational things that are important for understanding history. First is kind of an operational lesson, and that's what anyone who grew up like you and I did in a military that only had one enemy, the Soviet Union, and trained and studied Soviet doctrine. All of us, if you ever asked us, tell me about the strengths of the Soviet military, I believe the first thing out of almost everyone's mouth would be electronic warfare. Mm-hmm. They were always on the cutting edge. They were always better than us. They were always intercepting our information. We were always finding bugs. You remember all the famous bugs that were found. The Russians were always coming up with the Soviets new ways to do that, and new ways to counter our attempts to do the same thing to them. It's not like an admiration, it's a respect, and you have to understand your enemy and understand their strengths and weaknesses. We often default to the weaknesses, but the strengths, and in this case, incredibly important, because it will come back as we get to the war years, the past 3 years of war, how anyone who didn't understand this going into this war was surprised, but shouldn't have been, by their incredible capability to use EW. And in the same breath, I'd say it also told us they listened to that phone call, but they were likely listening to every phone call. And we now know through some of the cables that one of the big reasons we wanted to overthrow Yanukovych and put a Western selected leader of Ukraine is not just the natural resources, the gas, the agriculture, but because we wanted to get the Baltic ports under our control in the Baltic Sea, Sevastopol, in Crimea. And it was mentioned over and over and over when they talked about, okay, and then what will happen? Well, we've got to go in and take the port. We've got to control. It was a central part of the whole motivation to overthrow the government. And remember, now think of Russia listening to this. That port has the same importance to Russia. It's their only warm water port as the Panama Canal does to the U.S.
Well, it goes way back to Tsarist Russia. I mean, it's
1700s.
Yeah.
But we just saw, one of the first things Trump did after he was inaugurated was tell Panama, hey, what you've been allowing to happen over the last 5 years cannot continue.
Yeah.
It's in the treaty. You cannot turn over the canal to the Chinese. You cannot give the Chinese preference for use of the canal over the United States. That's in the treaty. And I believe we'd be willing to take action if something went the opposite way on Panama Canal. So you can understand what Russia was thinking. And I believe that starting with that intercepted phone call and the other calls they were listening to, they were already going over their contingency plans of what to do in Crimea. And that's why they were able to act so effectively, so quickly after the overthrow. But let's go back to the overthrow. So on February 13th, this thing came to a head. I'm sorry, let me go back to two other things. I said there's three things about the phone call that are foundational. One is shows the incredible ability of Russia and their EW capacities, offensive and defensive. Two is it showed the extent of US and EU meddling in Ukrainian affairs. I mean, we're talking about who the next prime minister and president should be while the current one is still in office. The duly elected president is in office until 2016. And we're talking about how to do it, how to put them in. So it shows the extent of meddling. And the third thing it shows, it's in the phone call. She concludes the phone call with, hey, I talked to Jake Sullivan yesterday. He said that the vice president, Biden, is willing to call either of the candidates to get involved, to give, I think she called it an attaboy or something like that. And so it tells us that Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden were involved in the decision-making and the coordination of everything in Ukraine from
which gives insight to the last 4 years.
Exactly. So that's February 4th. On the 13th, 14th, the armed and fully protected, I'm talking shields, Kevlar, weapons, Molotov cocktails, neo-Nazi ultranationalists stormed the rest of the government buildings. The Yanukovych government fled in fear, which was a good decision. They would have been killed. And the overthrow was complete. And,
those guys were at J6 too, but that's a whole nother interview. But go ahead.
Yeah, I want to do that interview. So the very next day at midnight, the head of the new Ukrainian version of their CIA meets with the head of the CIA and head of MI6. And they're meeting because the very next day, John O'Brien flies in a private jet to give them marching orders for the way ahead. in Ukraine. And so this also tells you where else does the head of the CIA fly in secretly on a jet to a random country that just had a change of government? It doesn't happen. But in a country where you coordinated and executed that overthrow, you come in to give high fives, to give new marching orders, and that's what they did. And within 2 days, the little green men started appearing in Crimea. Shocking to these deep state administrators. How could this possibly happen? Putin's invading Crimea. He didn't invade Crimea. He did it from within. They came right out of the Navy base.
I had a Ukraine. I was there around that whole period, in and out as you were, and I was talking to a guy. He said they were in a room. The Russians came in to a room full of Ukrainian military that had been captured, and they said, "Okay, meet your new commander." And one of the Ukrainians stood up, and he was a Russian, plant inside the Ukrainian, platoon or whatever. And so they had that all planned out for a long time. Is my point.
Yeah, well, as we would too. After the 2004 overthrow, you would start making contingencies. Again, this is their Panama Canal. Yeah. And by the way, they had already had a treaty that had just been signed before Yanukovych came in that allowed the Russians to stay in that base till 2045. So it's not like it was about to end and they had to take action, but they knew they overthrew Yanukovych in 4. They knew that. Now they did it in 10. They listened to it on phone calls, and they listened to people talking about the naval base in Crimea and what a prize that would be for overthrowing Ukraine to kick Russia out of their only warm water port, their most important port in the world. So, Crimea, which is all ethnic Russians, majority ethnic Russians, they were able to take over Ukraine or Crimea without firing a shot, with really no violence, because it came from within, and they had already gone through the contingencies. Here, we need to get the police. There are police at different levels in Crimea. They needed to get all of them. They were all on their side. Again, ethnic Russians who had been watching what was happening unfolding in Maidan. And I can't emphasize that enough. When you talk about what happened, not just in Crimea, but Donbass, you're talking about the unintended consequences of hiring the neo-Nazi ultranationalists to do your dirty work. And then as the government is overthrown, there's a natural power vacuum. Our deep state administrators had not thought through very well how to these next steps after the government ended. So there was nothing except the victory, the spoils go to the victor, and the victor, the guys who took over those buildings, were the neo-Nazis and ultranationalists. Naturally, the new interim government the foundation of it was all neo-Nazi ultranationalists. 5 of the most important ministries, the ones that define what it means to be a Ukrainian, were all led by ultranationalist neo-Nazis in that period.
I'm watching my friends gain more and more weight. And then eventually, I got to tell you, this is a little dark, but bad diet literally killed my whole crew.
Wow.
Diabetes, a stroke. I mean, all kinds of stuff. It's like, you had a stroke? You're not even 50 years old. You guys got to quit eating this stuff. Your body knows what's what. You're not conscious of this. But that's why people will go to the refrigerator and they'll grab this and that and the other and put together this outrageously elaborate combination of foods. Your body's trying to reach balance. Unbeknownst to us, our bodies are always trying to reach homeostasis. You can't eat all of this stuff and expect to live a long time. And one thing led to another, and I went, forget this. We're going to make our own product. So we partnered with one of the world's top 3 biochemists where nutrition-specific study is concerned. I said, all I want is the best nutritional and immune support product in the world. So we mixed it in yogurt. It's a powder. I got a bag of it here. I keep one on the console all the time, just so I can show people.
Yeah.
And it's a powder. Now, this is not candy. This is hardcore nutrition, and sugar is an enemy. And most people do not know that the reason these bellies are showing up on people all over the place, your body makes fat to store the toxins it can't get rid of. So it just puts them over here. But I can tell you this, you take this for 30 days and then lay off of it for 2 or 3 days, and you'll go, good grief, give me some more. Skin, nails, hair growing back. Cut yourself and it heals in half the time.
And the problem is they were empowered and enabled to do whatever they wanted. And as you can watch in videos during the protests before the overthrow, what they wanted was Ukraine for Ukrainians. Ukrainian blood must be pure. Hatred for ethnic Russians was at a fever pitch. And now there was nothing stopping them for taking
That's
action.
why there's a big sense with me that we're fighting in a very old war here. I mean, this is old. I mean, we're fighting someone else's war, or funding someone else's war, essentially.
Yeah, no, and that's what I mean. It's so important to understand this, and then it's so important to understand why the ethnic Russian citizens of Crimea and Donbass did what they did, because they saw the enemy. They heard what these people were saying. They heard what their hatred, and their hatred was directed at them. And I said words matter, but actions speak louder than words. Well, there was a massacre. 3 busloads of Crimeans had gone to the Maidan protests to counter protest, to say, hey, we don't agree with you. There was a massacre of those individuals right after the sniper incident as they tried to return to Crimea. Then you had the Odessa massacre, which again was the beginning of what started as this long brewing civil war, but quickly transitioned. It wasn't really a civil war, it was an ethnic war. And the problem with ethnic wars is the tactic of choice to win an ethnic war is ethnic cleansing. And that's what immediately happened in Ukraine. Ethnic cleansing began. It began in Odessa, Mariupol, and then they turned their ire toward the citizens of Donbass. And
they literally burned those people in Odessa. I mean,
they did. They burned them to death. And if you look at who were in those buildings, it was children, women, older people who ran there for sanctuary. They weren't snipers or a group of fighters on there who had been trapped or cornered or whatever. So instantly you had these referendums come up because these people realized they need to protect themselves. The guy they voted for, Viktor Yanukovych, was actually born in Donbass. Ethnic Russian, understood them, represented them, but a completely neutral candidate who also supported Western Ukraine. He's gone. These neo-Nazis are running the government. They already heard what they said. Now they see what they're doing, burning people alive. You have to defend yourself. And they began forming organic militias. And they began talking, those militias began meeting and talking about, we've got to either have representation or independence. And an interesting thing throughout all this is JD Power somehow has an affiliate in Ukraine, and they were doing polls throughout all this. So I'll step back and go to the EU, the vote to go to EU, and then the Maidan protest being about, hey, even though all of us wanted to go into the EU, Yanukovych said no. Well, sorry, the polls don't support that. 51% of the people were against joining the EU. Only about 31% wanted. The rest were undecided. 53% were against joining NATO and had negative views of NATO during the Maidan protests. So when you hear this, we overthrew him because he went against the will of the people, and Maidan there's no facts to support that. The facts support the opposite. So the same thing happened here. In the first month after the overthrow of the Yanukovych government, Crimea has a vote for independence. It wins with 87% or something, some crazy number voting for independence. Putin does not want, he's being very cautious, and he sees this, agrees with it. They have to protect the base. That's what the people want. But he doesn't agree with Donbass independence for the other oblasts in eastern Ukraine. Let's go slow. Let's move slowly on that. But they want independence. They want representation. And J.D. Power poll shows that. Even a month after, when they started the killing, and they're now shelling, in 1 month after the overthrow, they're indiscriminately begin firing artillery into the Donbass region. So people are dying. J.D. Power does the poll. Almost no one talks about independence. All they want is representation in government. They consider themselves ethnic Russians, Ukrainians. They want to stay Ukrainian. And not only do the polls reflect this, but again, if you go back, watch the videos, and it's only the independent media that's in Donbass at the time, they're pleading, they're saying, how can a government do this to its own people? How can you bomb your own people? How can you indiscriminately kill? They're calling the Ukrainian junta at this time their government, and they're in shock because they don't have any idea that, hey, we want to be part of Russia. But that would come because the Ukrainian military, which wasn't a military in 2014, there was, I think, 60,000 men. The only military was the right wing and ultranationalists, and they became the foundation of the new military. The billions of dollars we began pumping in from 14 on is what built the Ukrainian military. From 14 to 22, when the war started,
Right.
The U.S. and EU built the Ukrainian military in an image of itself, which I'll get back to is one of the reasons that they're having such a hard time on the battlefield today. But we built it. And the only competent fighters in those first few months were the ultranationalist neo-Nazis, the Azov battalion, and it's the independent militias. They were all deputized as National Guard at that point. And that's when the killing just went to fever pitch. The indiscriminate killing is disgusting. You can see it on these videos, but it also reveals why mainstream media, even at that time, was not covering anything. Because if you turned a camera on what was happening on the ground, you couldn't come to any other conclusion than there was a humanitarian crisis, that an ethnic cleansing was being carried out by this thing called the Ukrainian military against these ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. And again, I'm not taking sides, and I'm not saying all Ukrainians are bad, because they were victims of this too. All they knew was the narrative coming out from, really crafted by Western propagandists, but delivered by Ukrainian politicians who are equally complicit in all this. All the hand-picked Ukrainian politicians, all the way up to Zelensky, are equally complicit in not taking care of their people, not telling their people the truth, and taking this ridiculous ethnic cleansing approach to how to deal with these ethnic Russians who don't agree with us. So that's what happened from 14 to 22. 14,000 people died. About twice that number were maimed. If you watch the videos, you're wondering, why are they only shelling? The people are asking this. They're saying, why do they only shell our houses and our apartments? Why don't they shell where these militias train, or, where the militias hang out? And the reason was right out of the Color Revolution playbook, which, had been codified in Sarajevo, the 98 days of bombing in Sarajevo, where the purpose is enunciated. The purpose was to create dissent among the people, to make life so difficult that they would be fed up and say, we got to overthrow this government ourselves. And that's really what they were trying to do in Donbass. As bizarre as it sounds, they were bombing these civilians with artillery and rocket fire in order to get them to a point where they became so fed up, they just said, okay, we want to go with you guys. We don't want independence. We want to be part of the new government in Ukraine.
It didn't work out that way. Yeah.
No, it didn't. It did the exact opposite. And I'll just fast forward. When anyone talks about, hey, that's controversial. Those countries can't be part of those regions can't be part of Russia. Well, it's too late.
Yeah.
Those people will never be part of Ukraine, and with good reason. And Ukraine had their chance. And again, I'm not talking about Ukrainian citizens, but their government had their chance, and they squandered it in those years by allowing this genocide to happen. And it was genocide. Another thing that comes up, if you go through the old UN records, you find out that the people of Eastern Ukraine filed something like 185 petitions to the UN Council on Human Rights to come in and investigate what was happening and help them. And none of those were acted upon because the global effort to, achieve what we're now trying to turn around was in place even then. The mainstream media wasn't going to help. These people were on their own, and that's what lost the Donbass. But as I said, we built the Ukraine in those intervening years. We built the Ukrainian military, I should say. And by the time Russia actually entered Ukraine militarily in 2022, you heard the same Mockingbird media description of unprovoked. Yet you can actually watch this on videotape too. You can watch some of these independent media who were on the ground when the first Russians drove into Donetsk and Luhansk, and you see people come up, some women, older women come up, they pound on these Russian commanders' chests. What took you so long? What took you so long? And then they hug them. Thank God you're here. And that's sums up the reaction. The people of Eastern Ukraine could not believe that the Russians did not enter earlier. They were begging someone to come in and save them. And when you watch these videos, they tug the strings of your heart. I believe we should have gone. It would have made sense for the U.S. to go in and protect them. The fact Europe didn't do it is a historians will look at that, and those European leaders will have nothing but shame
They have
for that period.
We don't have any moral authority anymore, but they really don't have any anymore. I mean, I think they were behind. Well, I think there was a much bigger agenda pushing something in East Ukraine and all into Russia, and they're behind that. So they don't care. I tell people they don't care about Ukrainians.
Yeah.
They just want the resources, the land, to settle old scores.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
I think the gas was a catalyst for Europe, to get their hands on the gas as safer, more secure. They could control it. They could make money off it. And so, the Mockingbird media word was unprovoked. Yet, I should add, so John O'Brien came in and created this cabal of intel agencies working this clandestine op against the will of or the knowledge of their governments. So one of the explosive things that's going to come out as we unpack the U.S. aid strings of grants and where the money went, you're going to see that from 2016 to 2020, the way they kept supplying the Ukrainian military, supplying CIA operations against Russia was clandestine, even against the Trump administration.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And we know that for a fact. Those payments are going to show that. But the two guys who were behind it are Bolton and Pompeo, and they're going to have to answer the mail on what they did during those 4 years. Because they continued this clandestine flow of money through USAID. It was buying advanced weaponry, but more than that, it was supplying these intel agencies. So during those years, we built 12 CIA MI6 Ukrainian intelligence outposts on the Russian border, 12 of them. And they weren't just electronic listening posts. These were operational posts. Guys were going in and out of these, going into Russia, conducting sabotage operations, assassination missions, which shouldn't surprise anyone that USAID was behind this, because USAID funded the Phoenix program in Vietnam. This has long been forgotten, but they were once again doing the same thing. And Brennan and his CIA henchmen left behinds were continuing this agenda. 12 bases. So let's go back to 2022 and calling it on, Putin's special military operation is unprovoked. And just take a second to imagine if today we found out that China, we just found out they've been working in Panama. Let's say we found out they've been clandestinely operating in the Mexican government for the past, let's say, 3 years. And they're about to tell the world that Mexico has agreed to sign a treaty with China to get all of their financial aid, as well as a major trade agreements with China. Now, as if that wouldn't be enough to set us off, at the same time, they're killing the 1.5 million U.S. expats who live in Mexico are being systematically killed, indiscriminately killed, not direct assassinations. They're bombing their houses and killing them, up to 14,000 of them. So as if that's not bad enough, now imagine that the Chinese version of the CIA put 12 bases along the Rio Grande between Houston and, go all the way to California, to Mexicali in California, on the border with California. 12 bases, and they're launching ops into the United States. So Americans are being killed. They're clandestinely trying to control our neighbor and launch future warfare against us, missile launchers, whatnot. They've got bases, intelligent collection bases. So when you put that together, those are facts. Those bases are still there. I didn't even mention the biolabs, which Russia knew about also. It would have happened long, long ago. Probably the first thing I mentioned with the treaty, we would have taken down whatever part of Mexico was agreeing to that. Those bases would have been wiped off the map. There's no end to what we would have done under the legal premise of the Monroe Doctrine.
Correct.
And no one in America would bat an eye for it. So when Putin comes in, and the stated purpose of the special military operation is to protect those people, in those ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine who are being systematically killed by the junta government in Kyiv. That's not unprovoked. You can't call that unprovoked.
And then you also had Kamala Harris and I think Brussels saying, Ukraine's going to join NATO a week before the invasion. So, that was a provocation also.
Yeah. And it turns out now, according to, again, Jeffrey Sachs, he had a conversation with Jake Sullivan, and Sullivan told him in December 2021, hey, we have no intention of letting Ukraine join NATO. Don't worry about that. It's not going to happen. Startling. And Sachs says that he said back to Jake Sullivan, you've got to tell people that. You've got to say it. That's one of the big catalysts that's creating Russia's stance, as well as Ukrainian nationalist stance. But it was never, according to Jake Sullivan, never intended. It was never a real issue. It was just one more part of the propaganda to manipulate people into this war. So again, when you take all that, you wrap it together, remember what I said, biologically, the same part of our brain that understands past, AK memory, is the part of our brain where that enables us to conduct forethought and think about the future. And if you don't understand the past, you can't understand or make sense of the future or sensible choices about what to do next. And that's how I'd conclude the sensible choice about what to do next is really happening right now. It's not even agreeing to Russian demands. It's just common sense. Crimea, beyond a shadow of a doubt, they voted. They are not coming back. The oblasts, the regions in eastern Ukraine, they're not coming back either, because those people would have to go back kicking and screaming, and that does not make
that's going to be the peace
a
treaty.
region.
Approximate lines of demarcation now, and then some kind of neutrality for the rest of Ukraine, or we'll see what happens. But I don't think it's going to take anything below what he can. What is absolute for the security of Russia. I think he's going to get it no matter what.
Yeah. Well, again, when you understand what happened, it's not like he's making unreasonable demands. They're just common sense, and they're a fait accompli based on what happened in the past. There's no other option. They left no other option. And then in terms of lessons, you're going to hear people, they'll watch this podcast and go, that's all counter bullshit. He's falling for Putin propaganda. Well, that's why Marco Rubio and Radcliffe need to do one foundational thing, and that's declassify the cables, the State Department CIA cables from 13, 14, 15. You can probably go all the way, but 13, 14 especially. Those cables, that's for people who haven't worked in the interagency context. Cables are what make are coordinate between agencies. They what make policy. They're what reinforce policy. They're the way the State Department and CIA communicates throughout their hierarchy.
Well, I'll say that straight up. We're not Putin apology. Look, Putin's had journalists murdered. He had Boris Nemtsov murdered. I mean, he's running a kleptocracy. I tell people though, you don't have to agree with him, but you got to understand what they're doing. And I had a Ukrainian refugee family in my house for 6 months. I was there during the invasion. I got across the Moldovan border, running from Russian paratroopers and cruise missiles and all that for a week. So I love the Ukrainian people. I think they've been abused really bad by us, in addition to the circumstances they're in. But I just think we got to face reality and stop the killing. That's my main goal.
Yep. And it's easier to do when you understand the facts. And it's easier to do when you make the distinction that what happened in the past happened by mostly non-elected officials. And, you could debate whether Joe Biden also fits that category. But certainly these, the head of the EU, the current head, and she's frothing at the mouth to continue the war. Ursula, and so is Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. They're unelected officials. These are not, and Starmer is talking for himself and his administration, not for the good people of Great Britain.
You can really tell there's a clear line of demarcation now. Who is for their own people and who is not? Who's working for someone else? Zelensky, Obama, Biden, they're all in that working for someone else category, along with most of these European leaders. But others are emerging, which is good, and we got to foster that process.
Yep. So do the right thing, end the war as quickly as possible. Use common sense when we do it. Correct the narrative. I saw yesterday an interview. I saw it online. It popped up on my feed between Shannon Breen of Fox and Pete Hegseth. And she's trying to get him. You can see there's still agendas out there. She's trying to get him to say that Putin invaded, right? It was Putin who started this war. And I'm sitting there going, what is she doing?
Oh, that's the whole, I was at an event with Bob Amsterdam the other day in DC with 100 law students, and professors in their room were rabid. This is all Putin's fault. It's not our fault. Blah blah blah. They cannot look at reality. They cannot, because it destroys all of their self-worth, their view of life, their view of the world, their life's work. And it's fascinating to watch, actually, but it's scary too.
Yeah, it really is, about mass psychosis. Yeah. So again, we got to learn from it, do the right thing for the people of Ukraine and Russia, and that's end the war, end the bloodletting, and learn from what happened. Never let it happen again. You saw in my paper, one of the recommendations, again, it's on CD Media and PeteBlaber.substack.com. One of my recommendations is we need an addendum to 12333. That's an executive order that prohibits assassinations without congressional approval. I'm a former military. It definitely was a common sense thing to do. It needs to include color revolutions.
And non-government organizations. We can't
and NGOs. Yeah, exactly. And Doge, what they just uncovered is game changing. I think we just saved the future of Georgia and Romania, because you stopped the ongoing color revolutions funded by USAID and Soros.
You literally turned off the spigot.
Yep. And we probably saved those countries. They can now govern themselves, chart their own course instead of a course charted for them by people who don't give one shit about them or their country.
Excellent. Well, Pete, thanks. I want to have you back because you're very knowledgeable, and we'll delve into some of these other issues. But thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Enjoy talking to you, Todd. Take care.
All right, take care.